Could I ask just a small favor from the folks up in the booth? Just for 3 minutes, could you turn up the house lights? Because I don't know if anybody's out there. I promise it'll go back down because I understand that lighting sets mood for the kind of service that people want to go to. But at least for the introduction of myself, I need to see who I'm talking to, if you don't mind. My name is Barry DeShetler, and I have the privilege of being your interim pastor for the next 8 weeks, I guess is what they've assigned. I thought you ought to know a little bit about me. I'm a married man, happily married for, I can't tell you the number of years because my wife would shoot me, but for a while. We have 2 wonderful children, a son who is a dentist down in Atlanta, Georgia, and a daughter who is in Portland, Maine. She's a CEO of a major company there. They are both married, and they have the world's best grandchildren. Just trying to, I know you probably think if you're grandparents, not many of you aren't obviously, but those of you who are, you probably think you have the best grandkids. No, I do. I've got pictures, so I can show you. The trouble is they just live so far away. My wife, who is the best part of me, is a clinical psychologist at the VA, which works out very well because I need 24-hour care, so that's kind of nice to have her on hand. And what else should I tell you about myself? I love basketball and sports. I still play basketball at my ripe old age. That's it for now. I'll get the rest of the sermon. Okay, now I can see who you are. I know where you're at. At least I can kind of glance in that way, even though technically I just see black with all those lights up there. So if you put the house lights back where they belong or where there you are. Okay. By the way, I know that some of you folks time sermons. It's not an offense to me. It really isn't. I've been a minister for 45 years. I know people time sermons. But what I'm about to say to you now doesn't count as sermon time, okay? I'll tell you when to start your watches. I just wanted to say before I start preaching, I wanted to offer you a pastoral word. And I just wanted to tell you, it's going to be all right. Just think you folks ought to know that, because things aren't the way they've always been or been for quite some time. And when things get unsettled, people worry and wonder. I'm here to tell you it's going to be all right. Now, it's not going to be all right because I'm the optimistic type. I am the optimistic type. I mean, I love Kenny Chesney and David Lee Murphy's song, "It's Going to Be All Right." I like that. It's not because I have this kind of emotion and good feeling about things in the future, or I have a great worldview outlook. That's not the reason it's going to be all right. It's not going to be all right because I'm here. Folks, you probably can tell this is not my first rodeo. I've been doing this for 45 years, and I have had, many people would say, considerable success at it. My last church was Christ Church in Kettering. It was, I was there for 17 years. And the bishop, when he asked me about going there, at first I refused because I knew I loved where I was and I knew the troubles there. But the second trip to his office, he told me, he said, the church is in a death spiral. You'd find that hard to believe. 2,500 member church, Christ Church was, in a death spiral. And DS said to me in another conference, it's in a death spiral. The staff parish committee is in a death spiral. There are terrible things happening. And so I went there. It's the third church I'd been sent to that was in trouble. And things, by the grace of God, turned out just fine. We had a wonderful ministry there. We started a couple of new contemporary worship services. We started 2 satellite campuses, South Campus of Christ Church in Mosaic. We've just finished, my last year there, a $4.7 million building project. We just had a wonderful ministry there, and I've been blessed everywhere I've gone. But it's not going to be all right, because I think I know how to do this stuff by the grace of God. It's not going to be all right because you guys have great programming here. I mean, I listen to that snack pack stuff and what you're doing for the Kids, there's nothing more important than feeding hungry kids. And the clothing ministry and your 4 Fairborn emphasis, I mean, it is just incredible stuff. And the church will always survive if it remembers to always focus outside of itself and not on the inside of its needs. As long as your folks, every church will do well, but that's not the reason you folks are going to be all right. It's not going to be all right because you have great staff here. I mean, I've met with Cindy and Megan and Stephen, and I've met with Kent this morning. I've met now some of the sound crew folks, and man, what a great little ensemble of musicians you have here. It's just good stuff, but that's not the reason you're going to be all right. You're not even going to be all right because you're here. Of course, you're the most important ingredient in any church is the parishioners, but that's not the reason you can be all right. You're going to be all right for this reason. God is gracious and Jesus is Lord. And there's nothing that anybody in this universe can do about that. There's no evil that can prevail. There's no trouble that can't be solved because Jesus Christ is Lord and God is gracious. So you folks, it's going to be all right. One last thing I want to say. I should have mentioned this earlier about myself before I got into that, and that is I have a horrible memory. It's not Alzheimer's. It's not dementia. It's been with me a long time. I mean, I was senior class president of our high school, fairly big high school, and at the end of the year they vote on most likely to succeed, best dressed, best dancer. You know what I got? Most forgetful. Honest goodness. And it has not gotten any better since. So I'm going to need your help. I mean, one of God's greatest ironies was to send me, a person who cannot remember names, to a church with 2,500 members. I mean, that was just a recipe for disaster. So whenever you see me, if you would be so kind to say, "Hi, Barry, I'm Pat," or "I'm Joe. I know you remember, but I'm Joe. I just thought I'd help you out a little." That kind of thing would be very gracious of you to do for me. All right, now I'm done with all that stuff. If you're starting your watch, start now. I want to tell you a true story. It's about the church that I served in Toledo for 11 years, Epworth United Methodist Church. A woman there by the name of Liz Alley. She was a short, roundish woman, pretty well up in years. She was the child of missionary parents. She'd spent her childhood and youth in India. She was deeply involved in the church, both locally and nationally and internationally. With her husband, in later years after he had passed, she was deeply involved in the life of the church. She was there every day, stuffing envelopes, answering the phones, that kind of thing. She had an ornery streak in her, which I really liked. I like people that you can play and tease with, because that's, in our family, that's how you showed affection and love. In our family, if they're nice to you, they don't really like you. So we would banter back and forth. Well, she lived at Swan Creek Presbyterian Home. Swan Creek Presbyterian Home was a nursing facility as well as an apartment building. I think it was 8 stories. She lived on the 7th floor, I believe it was. And it's appropriately located because it's on the Swan Creek in Toledo. And one Saturday morning, she decided she was going to go out for a walk on the path behind the facility. And she walked down the path, a little blacktop path for a little bit, sat down on one of the benches overlooking the creek. Over in the direction of the creek, she heard some ducks making a ruckus. And sure enough, when she got up to explore, she saw 5 or 6 beautifully colored mallard ducks near the shore on the creek. So Liz left the path and she made her way down through the weeds toward the ducks. Now the imagery that frankly humors me because Liz she's like 4'2", silver hair, and as I had mentioned, roundish, and her favorite color was purple. Every day, literally, she wore purple. It looked like a little blueberry going through the bushes, down to these ducks. Anyway, and as she neared them, all the ducks flew away except one mother hen who stayed right right there next to the shore, until Liz was almost close enough where she could reach out and touch that duck, no more than 4 or 5 feet away. And finally, that mother hen flew away too. Liz reasoned to herself, there's got to be a nest around here somewhere for a mother duck to risk so much danger. And so, sure enough, Liz looked around and she found there in the mud a telltale nest, a depression in the mud. And in there, you could tell that ducklings had recently hatched because there were little pieces of eggshell all about the nest. But there was one thing in the nest that surprised Liz. It was a golf ball. Apparently, the mother mallard had all of her chicks hatch except this one last warm golf ball that wouldn't hatch. Now, I have no idea, neither does she, is how that golf ball got in that nest. Don't know if a prankster put it there. Don't know if somebody from across the creek was practicing wedge shots and it just accidentally landed there. Don't know. I didn't even know ducks played golf. You know, maybe if they do, they play a top flight or a max fly. I don't know. But at any rate, there's that ball in the nest. Now, I know, it has to sound a bit funny that a bird should be so stupid as to try to hatch a golf ball. But in my business, I see human birds doing this all of the time. How many of us have dealt with people who get an idea in their head and they just can't get rid of it? You know? Maybe it's an employee who has an idea about how to save money or reorganize or offer some new product. But for good reasons, or maybe even bad reasons, management just cannot or will not do it. Nevertheless, with bulldog tenacity, with neurotic fixation, they push and they push and they push. Everybody around can see that this is going nowhere, and they'd want the employee to stop, to let go, but they insist, like a duck trying to hatch a golf ball. I've watched human relationships all but disintegrate because one person insists on trying to hatch a golf ball. Maybe in the past there was an indiscretion, an affair. And people have had counseling. There's been repentance and even forgiveness asked for and granted. But for some reason, the injured spouse simply cannot get it out of his or her mind. And so the whole of their married life is characterized by one spouse sitting on something hard, refusing to give it up and move on. Or maybe there's already a divorce, and it was an ugly event. And terrible things were said. That's how it was with my parents when they got a divorce. And maybe they said one party was a part of it, or maybe both parties were part of it. But yeah, bad things have been said. And yet years have passed. Years have passed. One person maybe moved on, tried to make peace with the past, but the other simply cannot, will not let it go. And to this day, even decades later, they cannot say one civil word to the other. It's their golf ball, and they're sitting on it. I think about all the funerals I've done over the years. I think I've done about 350 some over the years. A lot of them are, believe it or not, quite memorable. I remember my very first church I served as a student. It was Bradford, Ohio. I met a woman there whose husband was killed at a very young age, accidental, leaving her with her 2 young children. As it was my very first church and I didn't really know what I was doing, I was surprised to hear her say that for the longest time, many years in fact, she was angry at her husband for leaving her. I didn't understand that because it's not like he volunteered, you know, but for years she sat on it as if it were a golf ball, and it stifled her life. Limited its possibilities for moving on, maybe getting remarried, living life again. Such a thing could happen to anybody who loses a loved one. You know, in a year or two, most of the grieving should be over. Oh, of course there's going to be pain. There's always pain, heartbreaking loss. But after a year or two, life should begin to open up, to contain new possibilities and hope. The scar will be there, and scar tissue, as you know, is always tender tissue. There's going to be a sensitive spot. It'll never be the same. But people should come to a new normal. Prolonged and stifling grief can be the same as a golf ball, never hatching. I think a lot of what passes for depression these days is nothing more than somebody choosing to sit on an unhatched golf ball. A lot of what passes for depression is really anger. It's anger turned inward. Anger about something or someone that cannot be released or forgiven or disregarded. Some of you may know that when Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, married her husband, Robert Browning, her parents disowned her because they disapproved of the marriage. Their daughter Elizabeth wrote them almost every week telling them that she loved them and that she longed for reconciliation. After 10 years, Elizabeth Barrett Browning received a huge box in the mail. And in it was every single letter and note that she had written to her parents, and not one of them had been opened. Now, of course, these love letters are a classical part of English literature to this day, but it's sad. It's pathetic to think that parents should choose to sit on that golf ball and never to their dying days get up, move past it, reconcile, and live in love again. That's the problem of the first slave in the story. The satrap, that's what his official title is. He's a satrap. He has an unforgiving spirit. There's no pity or mercy abiding in him. He cannot pardon another even though he has been pardoned and shown immeasurable mercy. And so in the end, it robs him of the very life that he's so stingy with. You remember the story that Megan read just a little bit ago? Satrap has been loaned 10,000 talents, or bags of gold, if you will. Now, the satrap is a chief administrative officer of a province. To get the idea of the amount of money that has been loaned to him, you should probably know that the entire collection for a year in a wealthy province like Galilee, which is right on the trade routes, would be about 300 talents or bags of gold a year. This man has been loaned 10,000. He's been loaned the equivalent of 100 million workers' days' wage. And when he begs for time to pay back that debt, which is really an impossibility, the king shows pity on him and doesn't give him more time, just wipes the debt off the slate. Now, as the satrap is leaving the scene of the mercy seat, he comes upon a servant who owes him a very small amount. 100 denarii, that's the silver coin that's mentioned. The satrap demands immediate payment, and the servant who owes him this very small amount begs him for time to repay. He doesn't ask to forgive the loan, just more time to pay. Here the prospect of repayment is credible. It is, as I mentioned, a day's wage for about 100 days. The exact same words are used by this second slave to the first slave or satrap that the satrap used with the king. But as you know, the satrap refuses to show mercy even though the debt that he has been forgiven is about 500,000 to 600,000 times greater than the one he is asked to extend. Not forgive, just extend. He is, if you will, sitting on a golf ball, a high pinnacle, and it'll never hatch. How unfortunate that somebody forgiven so much cannot forgive. That someone who is granted mercy is not merciful. That one who is released will not release. One would think that those who are a part of the kingdom would reproduce the unbelievable patience and generosity of its sovereign. So that when some small thing or even some big thing imposes itself on their life, or should I say our life, they or we would be quick to forgive because they or we have been forgiven so much. Close with another true story. I read it in a Circuit Rider, which is a old magazine for preachers, or maybe it's a magazine for old preachers. I don't know what it is, but I read it. It was about a troubled church that couldn't keep a minister for more than a year or two. 8 pastors had come and gone in 11 years, all at the request of the congregation after controversy with one of its longtime members. Church blamed the bishop for sending them inept pastors. Pastors blamed the congregation. And in time, no pastors were willing to go to that church. Finally, in desperation, the bishop called a meeting that included some leaders of the congregation itself and 40 members of the annual conference, chosen at random, 20 clergy people, 20 lay people. And then they had this meeting. The bishop invited the leaders of the congregation to share their side of the story. And then the district superintendent was invited to share his point of view. And when everybody had had their say, the bishop addressed the gathering. He said, "Brothers and sisters, who shall we send to this tormented congregation to share with them the healing power of God?" Silence for a long time. Until one of the older pastors in the back spoke up. "I'll go," she said. And there was a collective gasp and buzzing of voices. Everybody knew that she had been on leave of absence for several years, and that she had left her last church in the wake of a scandalous divorce, precipitated by her husband's affair with a lay leader's wife. She had become an alcoholic, had been twice convicted of drunken driving, and had spent the last 6 months in prison and 1 month in a chemical dependency treatment center. There had been talk about taking her out of the ministry altogether, removing her credentials, but because she was so near retirement and had given so many years of faithful service and had made some progress in the rehabilitation program, they decided to let her remain in ministry and maybe put her in a small, loving congregation somewhere. "Are you sure?" Deborah, the bishop, asked. "This is a very difficult assignment." "This is a congregation in pain," she said. "And I know something about pain. I think I should be the one to go." Heads nodded around the room. She said, "There's one condition to my going. You must give me a free hand to do what is ever necessary to bring about healing. I have to know that I have your full support to do what's needed." She asked that of the congregation as well as the group that was there. All of them agreed to pray for her every day. She said, "It's my intention to visit every single member of this congregation before I perform any pastoral duties, including preaching. I'll not lead worship. I won't attend any meetings until that task is fulfilled." She said, "I suggest you arrange for somebody else to lead worship. I'll let you know when I'm ready to preach." The very next day, Deborah began her visits. She went from house to house, apartment to apartment, hospital bed to nursing home, introducing herself as the new pastor. She asked each person 2 questions. How is it that you have come to know and love Jesus Christ? And why is it that you've chosen to serve with him in this congregation? It took her 4.5 weeks, and she was warmly received by everyone except for one member. She called the lay leader, told him that she'd be ready to preach that Sunday. The sanctuary was packed. When she began her sermon, she said, "I want to share 2 things with you folks today. Number 1, how I came to know and love Jesus Christ. And number 2, why I believe that God has called me to serve him with you in this congregation." Stirring sermon. Many people were moved to tears. Then just as Deborah was about to ask them to join her in prayer, a man stood up in the back of the sanctuary and he shouted at her. It was Harry Wiersum, the man who had refused to see her when she called on him, the same man who had bedeviled so many pastors before. Others had told Deborah that he'd never recovered from his wife's death so many years ago. "Who do you think you are, sister?" he yelled. "We know all about you. You couldn't keep your husband and you're a drunk. You're the last thing we need in this church. We've got enough problems as it is." And he stood there glaring at her. His red knuckles were turning white as he gripped the pew in front of him. Deborah looked at him with sad eyes. She didn't speak for several seconds. It seemed like an eternity to the congregation. Nobody moved or even seemed to breathe. Finally, she spoke. "I'm a sinner, Harry," she said, with a soft, firm voice. "A forgiven sinner. And I have come to serve with sinners, forgiven sinners." And then she stepped down from the pulpit and she went down the center aisle, back to where Harry stood, still hanging onto the pew in front of him. She put her arm around his shoulder and she looked him in the eye. And she said, "I'm sorry about Mildred. She must have been very dear to you." And Harry just collapsed into her arms in a ball of tears and cried like a baby. And when he had finished, Deborah asked everyone to gather round, and she asked them to join hands, and they had prayer. And when the amen was said, Deborah was aware of something around her. I guess you'd call it, it felt like a collective sigh of relief. The congregation would be whole again. Deborah served that congregation for 12 years and retired at the age of 74. Harry Wiersum was her most outspoken supporter, and just before he died, he said that she was an answer to prayer. You see, Deborah did what Liz did. Liz, that little purple predator, when she got to that nest and found that golf ball, you know what she did? She took it. Or else that duck would have sat on this golf ball all summer long. An egg that wouldn't hatch. Now the duck might grieve the loss, but it's still better to have the illness taken away. That's what Deborah did. She took Harry's golf ball. Now in some ways, folks, it's easier to live with illness and dis-ease than it is to overcome it and get rid of it, but it is never better. I have no idea what golf balls you folks are sitting on. I have no idea what golf balls your family members are sitting on, or your coworkers are sitting on, or other folks are sitting on. I really don't know. But I can say this much. It is time to get off them, to leave them, to remove them from your nest or any nest that you've come in contact with. My word to you this morning is very simple. Take the golf balls and get rid of them. It is time to forgive life. It is time to forgive yourself. It is time to forgive others. Why? Because God has forgiven you. Amen. At this time in our order of worship, we'll be having communion. And you'll forgive me. This is obviously the first time I've ever served communion here, so I might do it right and I might do it wrong, but it'll get done. By the time we're done, you'll all have communion. I'll ask the ushers after I've had my prayer and words of institution to come forward and help distribute the elements. I understand that they are gluten-free, and so I want you to know that. And also want you to know that even if you're not a part of this congregation, you're not a part of any congregation, you just happen to be here this morning, you're more than welcome to share in the sacrament with us, because the United Methodist Church practices open communion. If you're in love and fellowship with God and neighbor, we invite you to partake. And now may the goodness of God, the peace of God, the grace of God go with you all till we gather again in the Lord's name. Amen.